The erased epoch title. What they found under the Astor Estate in 1893. In the autumn of 1893, a crew of labourers digging a new foundation on the Astor Estate in the Hudson Valley stopped working. They had hit something. Not rock, and not the old root cellar marked on the property maps. Something with edges. Something that had been cut and shaped and set in place by human hands. The foreman sent word up to the main house, and within 2 days the entire excavation was hidden. Under canvas, the workers were paid in full, and they were sent home early with firm instructions not to speak of what they had seen. The estate records from that year mention only a delay in construction caused by unstable ground. They do not mention the chamber. They do not mention the staircase that led down into it, and they say nothing at all about what the family brought up from beneath their own lawn in the weeks that followed. Before we go any further, if you find these forgotten corners of history as fascinating as I do, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. This channel exists to ask the questions the textbooks quietly step around, and the more of us who gather here, the harder these stories become to bury a second time. Now, let us go back to that hillside in the autumn of 1893. The Aster name needed no introduction in 1893. By that year, the family stood among the wealthiest in the United States, their fortune built first on the fur trade and then on the relentless purchase of Manhattan real estate. Their estate in the Hudson Valley was a sprawling property of manicured lawns, imported stone, and carefully arranged woodland. It was the kind of place designed to look as though it had always belonged exactly where it stood, and that, as it turned out, may have been closer to the truth than anyone intended. The expansion that began that spring was meant to be straightforward. A new wing for the main house, a deeper foundation to carry its weight, and a service tunnel linking the residence to the outbuildings further down the slope. The land had been surveyed, the plans had been signed. The crew expected nothing more unusual than clay, gravel, and the occasional stubborn boulder. Then, at a depth of roughly 11 feet, their tools stopped moving. What they had struck was not the grey, rough bedrock that runs beneath the Hudson Valley. This surface was smooth, it had been dressed flat, and it was laid in even courses, one block resting cleanly upon another, running in a straight line that matched nothing on any map or survey the estate possessed. The foreman climbed down to see it for himself. He ordered the men to clear along the wall rather than through it, and as the soil came away, the wall did not end. It curved, it rose, and before the light failed that evening, the crew had uncovered the unmistakable shape of an arch. An arch is not a foundation. A foundation is buried because it was always meant to be buried. An arch is an opening. It is a doorway, a thing designed to be walked through, and a doorway 11 feet below a Hudson Valley lawn is a doorway into a building that was standing and in use long before anyone thought to plant grass above it. Over the following days, the crew, now working under the direct supervision of men sent down from the house, cleared the soil from the face of the arch. Behind it, they found a passage. The passage was lined with brick, but not the soft, irregular brick of the colonial Hudson Valley. This brick was deep red, fine-grained, and fitted so tightly that a knife blade could not be slipped between the courses. The mortar did not crumble when struck. The steps that led down from the arch were stone, worn slightly hollow at their centres in the way that only generations of foot traffic can wear stone. Whatever this was, people had used it. People had walked these steps day after day, year after year, until their passing left a soft curve in solid rock. The passage opened into a chamber. The accounts that survive, passed quietly between the families of the labourers rather than written into any official ledger, describe a room far larger than the digging had suggested. The ceiling was vaulted, the walls were the same tight red brick, and the air, when the first lantern was lowered inside, was dry. It was not the damp, rotten air of a cellar that has been sealed for a season. It was dry, and still, and clean, as though the chamber had been holding its breath and waiting. The men who carried that first lantern through the arch did not stay long. What unsettled them, by every account that survived in the valley, was not anything frightening in the ordinary sense. There were no bones, there was no sign of violence or struggle or sudden flight. It was the opposite that troubled them. The chamber was orderly. It looked, they said afterward, less like a ruin and more like a room whose occupants had stepped out one morning and simply never returned. The floor was swept stone, level and even. Along one wall stood the fitted remains of shelving, and set into the brickwork at regular intervals were shallow recesses, each one about the size of a closed hand, their purpose impossible for any of the men to guess. Now, place this discovery in its proper year, because the year matters. 1893. 1893 was the year of the great financial panic that swept the United States, a collapse that closed banks and emptied factories and left the entire country shaken. But it was also the year of the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the event remembered ever after as the White City. For a few short months, an entire metropolis of brilliant white palaces rose along the shore of Lake Michigan. Vast domes, sweeping colonnades, classical buildings of impossible scale and detail, all of it gleaming and electrified and crowded with millions of visitors. And then, almost as quickly as it had appeared, the White City was gone. The official story tells us those magnificent structures were never meant to last. They were built of a temporary plaster compound, we are told, designed to be admired for a single season and then torn down. An entire white city, raised in a matter of months and demolished in a matter of weeks. There are those who look at the photographs of that exposition, at the craftsmanship in every cornice and every statue, and find the official story difficult to accept. They ask a simple question. What if the White City was not built at all? What if it was uncovered, cleaned, dressed in fresh plaster, displayed to a curious public, and then quietly removed before too many people thought to ask how a bankrupt nation had conjured a city of marble in a single year? Hold that question in your mind and return now to the Hudson Valley, to the Astor Estate, where in that very same year a family was standing inside a vaulted red brick chamber that no record admitted existed. If you have spent any time exploring this subject, you will already know the pattern. Across Europe and North America, there are countless old buildings whose ground floors sit oddly low. Their windows begin below the modern pavement. Their grand front doors open onto staircases that climb up to the street rather than down from it. The accepted explanation is that cities simply rise over time, that streets are repaved and ground is built up and the world slowly accumulates around its own ankles. But there is another reading, and it is the reading that the Astor Chamber seems to support. It is the idea that these lower floors were not slowly buried by the gentle drift of centuries. They were buried suddenly. They were buried by a great movement of earth and mud, a flood not of water, but of sediment, that swept across whole regions and left an older world entombed beneath the new one. And the survivors, or the inheritors, simply built again on top of what was left, treating the buried floors as foundations and the buried streets as bedrock. The chamber beneath the Astor lawn, by this reading, was never a cellar at all. It was the upper room of a building that had once stood proudly in open air. The arch was a front entrance. The worn steps led not down into the ground, but up into a daylight that vanished long before the Astors ever purchased the land. And then there is the question of what the chamber contained. The quiet accounts agree on certain details. Set into the walls were lengths of copper, green now with age, running in deliberate lines from the floor toward a fixture at the centre of the vaulted ceiling. There were no lamps, there were no torch brackets and no soot. A room used by torchlight or candlelight for any length of time carries the black memory of that fire on its ceiling. This ceiling was clean. For those who study the lost technologies of the old world, this absence is not a small thing. It is a signature. The theory holds that the buildings of that earlier civilization were not merely shelter. They were instruments. Their domes, their towers, their precise proportions, and their carefully placed metals allowed them to draw a gentle, usable energy from the atmosphere itself, a current freely available to anyone who knew how to build a structure that could receive it. A room lit without flame, a room warmed without a hearth, a chamber that stayed dry and clean and still for longer than anyone alive could measure. There was something else the accounts returned to again and again. Worked into the brick above the arch, on the inner side, facing anyone who stood within the chamber and looked back toward the passage, was a band of carving. It was not lettering of any alphabet the labourers recognised. It was a pattern of interlocking lines and curves, repeating, deliberate, cut with a precision that the men compared to machine work rather than to the hand of any mason. One of them, a stonecutter by trade, a man who had spent his life shaping rock, said plainly that he could not have reproduced it with the tools of his own century. That single remark, more than the brick, more than the copper, more than the worn steps, is the detail that has kept this story alive in the valley for generations. It is here that one particular member of the family becomes impossible to ignore. John Jacob Astor IV was not merely an heir to a fortune. He was an inventor, he held patents, he worked on improvements to engines and turbines, and in 1894, the year immediately after the discovery on the estate, he published a novel. It was a work of science fiction, and its pages are filled with descriptions of advanced power drawn from the natural forces of the planet, of energy harnessed cleanly and limitlessly from the earth and the air around it. A wealthy man writes a story about free and limitless energy, 1 year after his family uncovers a flameless chamber beneath their own estate. Perhaps that is nothing more than coincidence. Perhaps a man of restless imagination simply dreamed in the direction his age was already leaning. Or perhaps a man writes most vividly about the thing he has recently seen with his own eyes, and a novel is a safe place to set down a truth that cannot be spoken plainly. John Jacob Astor IV died in 1912 in the freezing water of the North Atlantic when the Titanic went down. He was, at the time, among the richest men in the world. Those who follow these threads have never been entirely comfortable with how many men of curious knowledge and inconvenient wealth happened to be aboard that single ship. But return finally to the estate and to the simple question of what happened next. The chamber was not open to scholars, it was not announced. No museum was invited to study the tight red brick, or the worn stone steps, or the green copper running toward a ceiling that had never known fire. Instead, the excavation was covered. The canvas went up. The labourers were paid generously, which is its own quiet kind of instruction, and they were sent away. The construction records were completed with that single bland phrase about unstable ground. The new wing was built, the lawn was relaid, and the Hudson Valley afternoon settled back over the place as though nothing beneath it had ever drawn breath. This is the part of the story that asks the most of us, not the brick, not the arch, not the absence of soot, the silence. Because a discovery like this in the hands of a family with that much wealth and that much reach does not stay secret by accident. It stays secret by decision. Somebody in the autumn of 1893 looked carefully at what had been found and decided that the world was better off not knowing. We are left, as we so often are, with more questions than the records will ever answer. What civilization laid that tight red brick? How long did its chambers sit in darkness before a shovel found it again? What was the copper for, and what did it once carry? And why, in a century that prized discovery and progress, and the proud announcement of every new marvel, did one of the most powerful families in America choose to take this particular marvel and press it quietly back down into the earth? Perhaps the ground beneath the old estates of the Hudson Valley holds nothing more than ordinary stone. Perhaps every worn step and every flameless room has a calm, ordinary explanation that simply never found its way into the books. But the next time you walk past a grand old house that seems to sit a little too low in its own grounds, with its lowest windows peering up at the level of the lawn, it is worth pausing for a moment. It is worth wondering what the people who built upon that ground chose to build over, and it is worth remembering that history, the version printed and bound and handed to us as settled fact, was written by the same hands that knew exactly where the canvas had been laid. The earth keeps its secrets well, and the families that own it keep them better. but the ground does not keep them forever.